Most men spend months trying to win over one woman. They buy expensive dinners, send countless texts, and exhaust themselves with endless pursuit only to watch her lose interest and move on to someone else. But what if I told you there's a psychological method that can create deep attraction in minutes instead of months? A technique so powerful it's been used by governments, advertisers, and master persuaders to control minds and influence behavior on a massive scale. This isn't about pickup lines or being someone you're not. This is about understanding the psychological triggers that create emotional addiction in women. The same triggers that make people binge-watch TV shows, buy products they don't need, and become obsessed with social media. This isn't about pickup lines or being someone you're not. This is about understanding the psychological triggers that create emotional addiction in women. The same triggers that make people binge-watch TV shows, buy products they don't need, and become obsessed with social media. Today, you're going to discover the psychological formula that turns casual interest into powerful obsession. You're going to learn why some men become instantly unforgettable, while others are forgotten within hours. And you're going to understand how to become the man women can't stop thinking about. But be warned, this information is powerful. It works on a psychological level that bypasses conscious resistance. Use it responsibly. Before we dive into the technique, you need to understand something crucial about how female attraction actually works. Most men think attraction builds gradually through compatibility, shared interests, and proving their worth over time. This is completely wrong. Female attraction operates through emotional intensity, not logical evaluation. Women become obsessed with men who make them feel intense emotions, not men who make logical sense as partners. This is why the nice guy who does everything right often loses to the bad boy who creates emotional chaos. It's not that women prefer bad treatment. It's that they're biologically programmed to become attached to sources of intense emotional experience. The technique I'm about to teach you exploits this psychological reality by creating controlled emotional intensity that triggers deep psychological attachment. Instead of trying to convince her you're a good choice logically, you're going to make her feel addicted to the emotional experience of being around you. This method works because it mimics the same psychological patterns that create addiction to entertainment, social media, and other behavioral triggers that modern society uses to capture attention and create dependency. The core of this seduction method is based on what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful tool for creating psychological dependency. This is the same principle that makes gambling addictive, social media compulsive, and certain TV shows impossible to stop watching. Here's how it works. Instead of providing consistent positive emotions, you create a pattern of emotional highs followed by emotional neutrality, then higher highs, then neutrality again. This pattern triggers the brain's reward system in a way that creates psychological craving. When someone experiences this emotional pattern with you, their brain starts associating you with the potential for intense positive feelings. But because those feelings aren't constant, they develop a psychological need to be around you to experience them again. This is why women become obsessed with men who are unpredictable, rather than men who are consistently nice. Predictable kindness doesn't trigger the reward system that creates addiction. Unpredictable positive experiences do. The key is creating this emotional pattern intentionally rather than accidentally. Most men who naturally attract women do this unconsciously. You're going to learn to do it deliberately. Before you can create emotional addiction, you need to capture her initial attention in a way that makes you stand out from every other man trying to talk to her. This requires understanding that women are constantly evaluating men for signs of confidence, social value, and emotional intelligence. The attention capture phase uses 3 specific techniques that immediately signal high value and create curiosity about who you are. The first technique is called playful challenge. Instead of complimenting her or trying to impress her, you make a lighthearted observation that suggests she needs to prove something to you. This immediately reverses the typical dynamic where men try to prove their worth to women. For example, instead of saying, "You're beautiful," you might say something like, "You seem like trouble. I bet you're the type who's never satisfied with anything." This creates immediate curiosity because most men approach her with obvious interest, but you're suggesting she might not meet your standards. The second technique is social proof demonstration. You need to communicate that other people value you without bragging or boasting. This could be stories about interesting experiences you've had, casual mentions of other people in your life, or simply the confidence that comes from knowing you have options. The third technique is mysterious intrigue. You reveal just enough about yourself to create curiosity, but hold back enough information to make her want to know more. You're not an open book. You're a puzzle she wants to solve. These techniques work because they trigger her competitive instincts and challenge her assumption that she's the prize in the interaction. Instead of chasing her approval, you're making her work for yours. Once you have her attention, you need to begin the process of creating emotional attachment through storytelling. This is where the real psychological manipulation begins, and it's incredibly powerful when done correctly. The key is telling stories that take her through intense emotional experiences while positioning yourself as the source of those emotions. You're not just telling her about events. You're making her feel the emotions those events created. Start with a story that creates positive emotions. Tell her about an experience that was exciting, adventurous, or deeply meaningful to you. But here's the crucial part. You need to tell the story in a way that makes her experience the emotions, not just understand the events. Use sensory details, emotional language, and dramatic pacing to pull her into the experience. Watch her facial expressions and body language to gauge how deeply she's connecting with the emotional content. Then, just as she's becoming absorbed in the positive emotions, you stop the story and change the subject to something completely neutral and mundane. Ask her about her job, her favorite food, or some other everyday topic. This sudden shift from emotional intensity to emotional neutrality creates a psychological state called emotional withdrawal. Her brain was starting to produce the chemicals associated with the positive emotions in your story, and suddenly, those chemicals are no longer being stimulated. After a few minutes of neutral conversation, you return to emotional storytelling, but this time with a story that creates different emotions, perhaps something more vulnerable or even mildly sad. Again, you pull her deep into the emotional experience, then shift back to neutral topics. This pattern of emotional intensity, followed by emotional neutrality, followed by different emotional intensity, creates the roller coaster effect that triggers psychological attachment. The third phase involves creating deeper emotional connection through strategic vulnerability. This is where you begin to establish the trust and emotional intimacy that transforms attraction into obsession. But this isn't about sharing your deepest secrets or emotional problems. Strategic vulnerability means revealing carefully chosen personal information that makes you more interesting and relatable while maintaining your attractive qualities. The key is reciprocal vulnerability. You share something personal about yourself, then create space for her to share something personal about herself. This back and forth creates emotional intimacy while giving you crucial information about her psychological triggers. Start by sharing a story about a challenge you overcame or a lesson you learned. Make it personal enough to show depth, but not so dramatic that it overshadows your strength and capability. The goal is to show that you're human without appearing weak or needy. Then guide the conversation toward her experiences. Ask questions that encourage her to share similar stories about challenges, growth, or meaningful experiences. Pay close attention to what emotions these stories generate and what themes seem most important to her. As she shares personal information, you're gathering intelligence about her psychological makeup. What makes her happy? What makes her sad? What experiences have shaped her? What does she value most? This information becomes crucial for the next phase. The vulnerability exchange also serves another important function. It makes her invest emotionally in the interaction. When someone shares personal information, they become psychologically invested in the relationship with the person they shared it with. If you're finding this analysis of female psychology fascinating, if these insights are opening your eyes to patterns you've never understood before, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because this level of psychological understanding isn't available anywhere else. We're diving deep into the unconscious triggers that create female obsession, and you need all of this information if you want to master the art of attraction. The fourth phase is where the real psychological magic happens. You're going to create what psychologists call emotional anchors, specific triggers that make her associate intense positive emotions with you personally. This works by deliberately creating peak emotional experiences while you're together, then linking those emotions to your presence through specific phrases, touches, or other sensory triggers. Start by creating a conversation or experience that generates intense positive emotions. This could be sharing an exciting story, engaging in playful banter that makes her laugh, or discussing something she's passionate about in a way that makes her feel understood and appreciated. Pay attention to the moment when she's experiencing the most intense, positive emotion. This is usually visible through her facial expressions, body language, and energy level. At that exact moment, you introduce a specific anchor, perhaps a particular phrase, a light touch on her arm, or even just intense eye contact. The anchor should be something you can easily repeat later. The goal is to create a psychological association between that specific trigger and the intense positive emotion she was feeling at the moment you introduced it. Later in the conversation or in future interactions, you can reintroduce the same anchor to trigger the associated positive emotions. If done correctly, she'll experience the same emotional intensity she felt when the anchor was first established, even if the current situation is completely different. This technique is incredibly powerful because it allows you to trigger positive emotions on command. Every time you use the anchor, you're reinforcing her psychological association between you and intense positive feelings. The fifth phase is perhaps the most crucial for creating long-term obsession rather than just temporary attraction. This is where you begin to introduce strategic distance that makes her realize how much she values your presence. After you've established emotional connection and positive anchoring, you need to create contrast by becoming less available. This doesn't mean disappearing completely or playing silly games. It means becoming genuinely busy with other important aspects of your life while maintaining the connection you've built. The psychological principle here is scarcity and loss aversion. When something valuable becomes less available, our desire for it intensifies. When someone we're emotionally connected to becomes less accessible, we start thinking about them more, not less. But the withdrawal has to feel natural and justified, not manipulative or punitive. You're not pulling away because you're not interested. You're pulling away because you have other important things in your life that require your attention. This could mean taking longer to respond to messages because you're focused on work or personal projects. It could mean being less immediately available for dates because you have other commitments. It could mean ending conversations while they're still going well instead of talking until one of you runs out of things to say. The key is maintaining the emotional connection while reducing the frequency of interaction. When you do interact, the emotional intensity should be the same or higher than before. You're not becoming cold or distant. You're becoming selective about when and how you engage. This pattern creates psychological tension that makes her think about you when you're not around. She'll start wondering what you're doing, who you're with, and when she'll see you again. This mental preoccupation is the beginning of obsession. The final phase involves creating a sustainable pattern that maintains her psychological addiction to the emotional experiences you provide. This is where temporary attraction becomes long-term obsession. The addiction cycle works by establishing a predictable pattern of emotional highs and valleys that keeps her in a constant state of anticipation. She never knows exactly when the next emotional peak will come, but she knows it will come, and she knows it will be worth waiting for. This pattern mimics the psychological structure of addictive behaviors. Just like a gambler never knows when the next big win will come, but knows it's possible. She never knows when the next intense positive interaction with you will occur, but she knows it's possible. The key is varying the timing and intensity of positive interactions while maintaining enough consistency to keep her engaged. Sometimes you provide intense emotional experiences, sometimes moderate ones, sometimes you're neutral and distant, but the possibility of intensity is always present. This unpredictability triggers what psychologists call variable ratio reinforcement, the most powerful schedule for creating behavioral persistence. She'll continue seeking interactions with you because the potential reward, intense positive emotions, is always possible, even though it's not guaranteed. To use this method effectively, you need to understand the psychological mechanisms that make it work. The human brain is wired to become attached to sources of intense and unpredictable positive experiences. This wiring evolved because our ancestors needed to become attached to resources that could provide survival benefits, but weren't always available. Food, safety, and social connection were all intermittent rewards that required persistence to obtain. Modern women inherit the same psychological wiring, which means they become most attached to men who provide intermittent, intense, positive experiences rather than consistent, moderate, positive experiences. The emotional roller coaster you create triggers the release of dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and motivation. But dopamine isn't released when pleasure is experienced. It's released when pleasure is anticipated. This means the periods of emotional neutrality between positive experiences are actually crucial for maintaining attraction. They create anticipation for the next positive experience, which generates more psychological engagement than constant positivity would. The vulnerability exchange triggers oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, which creates feelings of trust and emotional connection. The emotional anchoring creates classical conditioning that links positive emotions to your specific presence or actions. Understanding these mechanisms helps you use the technique more effectively, because you can recognize when each psychological trigger is being activated and adjust your approach accordingly. Once you understand the basic formula, there are advanced strategies that can make it even more effective for creating deep attraction and long-term obsession. The first advanced strategy is emotional layering. Instead of creating simple, positive, and neutral experiences, you create complex emotional experiences that involve multiple feelings simultaneously. For example, you might tell a story that's exciting and slightly dangerous, which creates both arousal and mild anxiety. These complex emotional experiences are more memorable and create stronger psychological associations than simple emotions. They also make you seem more psychologically sophisticated and emotionally intelligent, which is highly attractive to women. The second advanced strategy is psychological mirroring. You pay attention to her emotional patterns and psychological needs, then structure your emotional offerings to complement and fulfill those needs. If she craves excitement, you provide adventure. If she needs security, you provide stability. If she wants mystery, you provide intrigue. This doesn't mean becoming whoever she wants you to be. It means understanding what emotional experiences she values most and ensuring that your natural personality provides those experiences in a way that feels authentic to you. The third advanced strategy is social proof integration. You create emotional experiences that involve other people, which demonstrates your social value while building emotional connection. This could be taking her to events where you're clearly respected and valued, or sharing stories about your relationships with other people that demonstrate your character and social intelligence. Even when men understand this psychological formula, they often make implementation mistakes that reduce its effectiveness, or even backfire completely. The most common mistake is applying the technique too aggressively or obviously. If she realizes you're deliberately manipulating her emotions, the entire method loses its power and may even create resentment. The emotional changes need to feel natural and driven by genuine conversation and circumstances, not like you're following a script or using a technique. This requires practice and social calibration to execute smoothly. The second common mistake is creating negative emotions instead of neutral emotions during the withdrawal phases. The goal is emotional neutrality, not emotional negativity. You're not trying to make her feel bad. You're trying to create contrast that makes the positive emotions more impactful. The third common mistake is maintaining the emotional roller coaster for too long without building deeper connection. This technique is designed to create initial attraction and interest, but long-term relationships require genuine compatibility and mutual respect. If you use this method successfully, but don't follow up with authentic relationship building, you'll create attraction without substance, which ultimately leads to disappointment for both parties. This psychological formula is extremely powerful, which means it comes with significant ethical responsibilities. You're influencing someone's emotions and psychological state in ways they may not consciously recognize. The ethical use of this technique requires genuine interest in the woman as a person, not just as a target for psychological manipulation. If you're only interested in short-term conquest or improving your ability to influence others, this method can cause real psychological harm. The goal should be creating mutual attraction and connection that benefits both parties, not gaining power over someone for selfish purposes. Used correctly, this technique helps compatible people recognize their mutual attraction more quickly. Used incorrectly, it can create false attachments and emotional manipulation. You also need to be prepared for the intensity of attachment this method can create. When someone becomes psychologically addicted to the emotional experiences you provide, ending the relationship becomes much more difficult and potentially traumatic for them. While this formula can create rapid attraction and initial obsession, building a healthy long-term relationship requires transitioning from psychological manipulation to genuine partnership based on mutual respect and compatibility. Think of this technique as a way to accelerate initial attraction and create the emotional intensity needed for deep connection to develop. But once that connection exists, the relationship needs to evolve beyond emotional roller coasters to more stable, mature forms of intimacy. The most successful long-term relationships involve men who understand how to create emotional intensity when it's needed, but also know how to provide emotional stability and security as the foundation for partnership. This means gradually reducing the emotional manipulation aspects of the technique while maintaining the emotional intelligence and social awareness that made it effective in the first place. Becoming truly skilled at this psychological formula requires practice, social awareness, and continuous refinement of your approach based on results and feedback. Start by practicing the individual components: attention capture, emotional storytelling, vulnerability exchange, emotional anchoring in low-pressure social situations where you can experiment without significant consequences. Pay attention to how different women respond to different emotional triggers. Some women are more responsive to excitement and adventure, others to vulnerability and depth, others to humor and playfulness. Learning to read these preferences quickly will make your approach more effective. Develop a collection of stories and conversational tools that reliably create specific emotional responses. The more options you have for creating different emotional experiences, the more flexible and effective your approach will be. Most importantly, work on becoming the kind of man who naturally provides the emotional experiences that women find addictive. The technique works best when it's an amplification of your natural personality rather than a complete performance. Understanding this psychological formula gives you a choice that most men never get to make consciously. You can continue approaching attraction the way society tells you to, through logic, persistence, and proving your worth. Or you can understand and use the psychological triggers that actually create female obsession. The men who master this approach become the men that women can't stop thinking about, can't get over, and remember for years after brief encounters. They become the standard against which other men are measured. The men who ignore this psychological reality continue struggling with attraction, wondering why their best efforts often produce disappointing results, and never understanding why some men seem to effortlessly attract women while they have to work so hard for mediocre outcomes. The information is now yours. The psychological mechanisms are explained. The formula is laid out step by step. The only question remaining is whether you have the courage to use this knowledge and the wisdom to use it responsibly. The women you want are waiting for a man who understands these psychological triggers. The question is whether you'll become that man or continue being just another guy who doesn't understand how attraction really works. Choose wisely. Your romantic future depends on it.